Last month, in anticipation of US strikes on Iran, CMEC spoke to the UK's former ambassador to Iran, Nicholas Hopton, now Director General of the Middle East Association, and to Sir John Jenkins, former ambassador to several Middle East countries, including Saudi Arabia. Now, over the weekend, we have seen US and Israeli strikes in Iran, killing Iran's supreme leader, Ali Hosseini Khameini, and a number of high-ranking regime officials. Iran has retaliated with strikes across the Gulf and Israel. The situation is dynamic and developing at time of recording. I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and I'm delighted to be joined again by Nicholas Hopton, who was ambassador in Tehran between 2016 and 2018, to give us an update and his perspective on what has happened this weekend and what the future might look like. Nicholas, thank you for taking the time. What, in your view, are the key events over the weekend? Obviously, it's been very eventful.
Well, I would go back slightly further than that, Charlotte, to the negotiations that took place in Geneva last Thursday between the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner on behalf of the White House, brokered by the Omani Foreign Minister. Now, those negotiations after them, they were inconclusive, as were the previous two rounds, recent rounds of negotiations. But those negotiations afterwards, both sides briefed that there had been some progress towards at least finding a framework for the negotiations to progress. And the intention was to meet the following week. Foreign Minister Said Badr actually came on air by his own initiative after that and said, I think probably in an attempt to head off what he saw were impending imminent US-Israeli strikes. And he said actually there had been a breakthrough, as he put it, and that it was possible to see how a deal which would meet the US demands that Iran should never have the possibility of a nuclear weapon, how that could be reached. And a large part of that, he revealed, was about agreements on no stockpiling of enriched uranium. So that is important context because that's where we were on Friday. Yet, I was not alone, I don't think, in feeling that on Friday things were heading towards in a very different direction. It has become clearer that the negotiations were not really a negotiation. They were demands by one side, and the other side was facing these demands at the barrel of a gun. Now, neither side in those circumstances was going to reach agreement, it seems, and that is the background to President Trump seemingly deciding with the encouragement of Prime Minister Netanyahu, to move ahead with military strikes and break off the negotiations. The trigger seems to have been the fact that the Americans understood at least where the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, would be at a certain time on Saturday. And that probably accounted for the timing of the operation because they knew they could take him out, and they decided to do that. And then they also took out large other numbers of senior Iranian civilian and military leaders. So that was the background. And then over the weekend, this has unfolded. The Iranians have retaliated in a different way from last June during the 12-day war with Israel. This is a very different response. The system has kicked in Iran, and they've shown that they're still in control. They have nominated a three-man committee as envisaged by the Constitution, Article 111. And that committee is led by Ayatollah Ali Reza Arefi, who is an interesting choice. He's the natural choice in as much as he's the deputy chair of the Assembly of Experts, which is the body who are meant to oversee the choosing of the next supreme leader. But it's also an interesting choice because he could be seen, maybe wishful thinking, but he could be seen as a conciliatory figure, someone who could actually take a different approach from his predecessor, to whom he was close, of course. And the reasons for that are he's not seen as a particularly political or security figure. His role in the state has been to oversee the seminaries, instructing young Iranian clerics. And interestingly, he obviously has the ability to engage with the West and with other leaders because he speaks fluent Arabic and English, but also he met with Pope Francis in the Vatican as recently as 2022. So it's an interesting choice. That said, and here I'll conclude my thoughts on the weekend, because that said, what we've seen since his nomination and the replacement of the hierarchy in the Iranian system is actually a doubling down on attacking more and more targets, spreading the destruction, chaos, trying to ramp up the conflict rather than diminish it. There doesn't seem to be an appetite in Tehran at the moment for talks, even if Donald Trump wanted them, as he has at moments in the last 24 hours suggested he might. At other times, as with Hesketh just now, the defense secretary, we see a line coming out of the White House which is uncompromising and will pursue the military campaign. So we're at a critical moment after an intense weekend and full of peril, full of risk, and we haven't even touched on how this has impacted on the UK, of course.
Going beyond Iran, of course, Iran's strikes have hit US capability and assets in Gulf states, including in Oman. How is that going down in Gulf states, and how will that affect that always delicate relationship between the Sunni Gulf states and Iran?
Well, I think because they've now hit Oman as well, they've hit all the GCC states, and which the Iranians say they're not striking those states. They're trying to make the distinction between striking US interests there and Israeli interests, because they have been targeting the US bases, some of which, of course, are shared with the UK. But I don't think that's washing very much with the Gulf states themselves, who are furious. I imagine they're furious for several reasons. One is that their demands to President Trump to continue pursuing negotiation towards a deal rather than military action were ignored. Secondly, because they are now finding themselves in the front line without apparently receiving enough defensive support from the US in particular, because missiles, drones are hitting buildings, including landmarks such as the Burj Khalifa, such as airports, not just military bases. And their airspace is closed and their economies are being massively disrupted. And of course, the Straits of Hormuz are effectively closed. So the oil price will go up. Their exports, their economies will be damaged if this carries on very long. And the damage could be quite significant. So the Gulf states are all in a very vulnerable position and will be, I imagine, hoping and lobbying Washington to bring this military phase to a conclusion as soon as possible.
And the strike on Oman was quite surprising, given the Omanis' role in trying to broker negotiations and prevent this from happening.
Exactly. I think that was the last of the GCC states to be hit yesterday evening, I think it was. And the target, of course, was considerably far away from Muscat, the capital. But I think this will have caused huge anger and concern in Muscat, because of the very constructive role that Oman has been playing, not just in the latest round of negotiations, but consistently in trying to de-escalate and find ways forward in the problematic Western and particularly US relationship with Iran.
So the constantly cited reason for all this was not only, Iran's nuclear capability, but also President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu's desire for regime change in Iran. I remember we spoke, I think it was last month, and you and Sir John Jenkins were saying that what follows may not be the kind of regime change that President Trump would have in mind. It might be worse, might be more hardline, or it might be chaos. How realistic is that concept of regime change now, do you think?
Well, I think the Israeli Prime Minister has been fairly consistent about this, that is his primary objective, because he clearly sees that as the best way to secure Israel's security in the region and other objectives. President Trump has given varied accounts, shall we say, of what his main objective is at any one time, including in the last few days. So as recently as Friday, he was talking about negotiations still being the way forward and his preference. But we've seen the decision he took, which was different, to go for a military option. And initially, he was still talking about securing an outcome which stopped Iran ever having a nuclear weapon, but very rapidly on Saturday moved actually to a position of saying actually it's all about getting a better regime in place, and then calling on the Iranian people to rise up, seize control of their country. Now, after the killing of the supreme leader, the Iranian people did go out on the street and celebrate. Not all, by any means, because it's a very big, diverse population. Not all will be happy. Quite a lot also came out and were mourning the loss or the killing of the supreme leader. But there was a significant presence on the streets in different cities across Iran celebrating, and some of the social media footage of that got out. However, I don't think we should yet interpret that as a popular uprising seizing control of the country, as the President Trump has called for, because what's happened since is that window, if you like, on immediately after the killing of the supreme leader was confirmed, that window seems to have closed, even already. And most Iranians are not out on the streets. They're keeping their heads down. They're waiting to see which way the wind blows. They will have noted that the regime is still very much in control, despite the country being under fierce attack from Israel and the United States. And over 500 civilians, apparently, or 500 Iranians have been killed. And we know from other sources that 150 or more schoolgirls were killed in one of those attacks, which is obviously very distressing, as is all the loss of life that's taking place through this conflict. So we haven't yet seen that popular uprising, and it doesn't seem imminent at the moment. The US approach seems to be designed now, yes, to affect conditions where regime change could happen. They're taking out security installations, police stations, and so forth in many parts of the country, including, and perhaps importantly, most importantly, in regions which have been traditionally very fragile and turbulent, such as in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, where actually, if the Iranian state security apparatus disappeared, then you could expect very quickly to see uprisings. But Tehran's a different kettle of fish, as are the other main cities in the central part of Iran. So I don't think we're yet at a stage where regime change seems imminent, to be honest. The Iranians have a new structure in place to oversee the choosing of their next leader. They're proceeding with that. They've entered 40 days of mourning for Ali Khamenei, the killed supreme leader, and the regime seems very much in charge still. So I think the risks at this point are high, and it is a time of peril. But the president has choices, and if we talk about what the UK's role should be at this point, I think we have a role to play in helping the United States find the best way forward at this critical juncture.
One final question, which feeds into what the US and the UK should be doing. Of course, Supreme Leader Khamenei was not only, and correct me if I'm wrong, the significant political figure in Iran, but also a significant figure in Shia Islam beyond the political boundaries of Iran. What effect has his killing had on the Shia community, thinking particularly of Iraq? How should that be factored in for the US and the UK and other European countries in managing the consequences of this killing?
I think this will be a further big concern for the countries in the region, in the GCC. Saudi Arabia also has a significant Shia population, as do other GCC countries. They aren't necessarily aligned in any way with the Islamic regime in Iran, but as we saw in the past, where there is a Shia unity which can come into play. Now, already we've seen strong reactions to the killing of the supreme leader in Pakistan, attacks on the US embassy, and in Iraq as well. So the risk at the moment, as I see it, is that this conflict is rapidly escalating. Today, we've seen further countries being dragged into this. Not only the UK is now clearly a target for Iranian missiles and drones, with the bases in Cyprus being attacked, but also the Israelis have used this opportunity to hit Hezbollah again in Lebanon. Lebanon is already very fragile, of course, but is likely to see further escalation on the ground. And the risk is that this conflict will rapidly escalate out of control. And the one thing that is missing at the moment, which might reassure the allies of the United States, and this is where the United Kingdom can help, given our experience and historical relationships in the region, knowledge of the region, is there is a lack of a clear endgame plan or day after plan. What does President Trump want to achieve beyond seeing a popular uprising in Iran, which, as I say, is not looking imminent? So I think without that sense of Washington, the White House at the least, having a clear endgame in mind other than continuing the military campaign, the countries in the region, but also the close allies of the United States, such as the United Kingdom, will be very concerned. And in our case, as the British, we do have a role in Washington to try and explain, influence, at least to people around the president, why at this point he should be looking for, if not exactly an off-ramp, although that's an option, to declare victory, say he's already changed the regime. He has. Try and achieve his objectives through talks and negotiations, which would be on his terms given the situation. That's one option, but the UK, through our new ambassador in Washington, Christian Turner, who's an excellent diplomat, and his team, we should be trying to get in there and help the US move on and find an outcome that makes the region, restabilizes the region, meets our national interests, meets the US's interests, and also, very importantly, brings a better future and the prospect of stability and better governance to the Iranian people.
Nicholas Hopton, former ambassador to Tehran, thank you very much for your time. What I know is a very, very busy day.
Thank you.